There's a trend playing out in coaching that we need to be paying attention to. Good coaches are quitting, preferring to walk away and put themselves and their families through the lifestyle. Sports should be the bastion for leadership, not the industry leaders are fleeing. That was a tweet from today's guest, Cody Royle, where in a thread of tweets, he went on to share numerous examples of coaches at all levels all across the world leaving coaching. Cody Royle, who is the author of the book The Tough Stuff and a coach for coaches like myself and Nate, was on the podcast back in episodes 255 and 256. And due to the fact that he is my favorite person to follow on social media, and I enjoy chatting with him, we decided to bring him back on the podcast to have a conversation around more tough stuff in coaching. So, welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. I'm JP Nurbin, the founder of not just this podcast, but TOC, which provides coaching and resources on leadership and culture for coaches. I'm joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. If you are new to this podcast, be sure to go to tocculture.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter, which has free notes to this and every episode of the pod, as well as a free chapter of my book, The Culture System. Now, let's get right into our conversation with Cody. All right, so Cody, one of the things that I really appreciate about you is that you talk about, honestly, the tough stuff, the real shit about coaching, like the hard stuff that we have to go through as coaches. And there have been a few things that you've been focusing on, especially the last few months, especially on social media. And one is this growing trend of coaches leaving the profession. Could you maybe start by talking a little bit about, what's happening with all this, this coach exodus from the profession, as well as why this is so important to you?
Yeah, that thread blew up. I didn't really expect that, to be honest with you. What I was trying to do was really just show people the patchwork of it and the landscape of it across the world. Because, after writing The Tough Stuff, generally when there's something comes up around coach well-being or health or some of the tough stuff that I talk about, people send me the articles, like they'll DM me, like, hey, did you see this? And I just was getting so many articles sent to me from all around the world about particularly either coaches being fired in a really unprofessional way or coaches deciding to walk away of their own accord. And so I wanted to put those together for people to say, this isn't an isolated incident because you're only paying attention to basketball or to soccer or to rugby or whatever it may be. And when you put it together for someone in a Twitter thread of 25 messages and saying, here's another, and here's another, and here's another, and here's what this person said, and here's the circumstance that this person walked into, and these are high talent, highly accomplished people that are just up and leaving and have had a gutful of putting up with all the different variables. And it's not just college, and it's pro, and it's women, and it's men, and it's, And so what I was trying to do with that was really piece it together to people and say, this is a real issue. And on top of that is the unfortunate part is that sport is supposed to be about leadership. We are supposed to be the industry that provides leadership and that everyone looks to for, what great leaders look like and sound like. And we do most of our coaching in the public domain so people can actually draw from it and see what it's like when Steve Kerr does a timeout address. And what we're doing, rather than being held up as that bastion of leadership, is we're actually chasing the best leaders out of our industry. And they're going and doing other things. And so I just want to caution people on that as well, because, what we should want is the best leaders and the best coaches in sports and in our sport, so that because we know what they can do for our athletes and particularly in the college ranks where, they're young, formative people that are going to go on and do great things. And so, yeah, I wanted to show people that it was a global issue. And then I wanted to show people that what we're doing is chasing away great leaders from our industry when we're supposed to be the one that's providing the world with the greatest leaders.
what I really appreciated about that thread was that you showed how it wasn't isolated to one sport and one part, of the world. I think there's a lot of talk, obviously, in the States around college coaches leaving because of the transfer portal and the players getting paid, and how difficult that is, the challenges that's posing for those coaches. But you showed that it's a global issue. So I guess my next question is, are you starting to see some common trends, you know, two or three things that are really creating this exodus of coaching, or firing from their profession?
Yeah, I would say the one that is immediately in front is actually probably administrators or bosses, and essentially coaches getting a gutful of poor administration as a whole. So whether that's in the college ranks and it is like an AD or a president or whatever, or an owner in professional sports, uh, the kind of fractured, friction soaked environments that coaches are often put into eventually wears them down and is the largest source of burnout. The job doesn't burn people out. Coaches love coaching. It's not the being on the court or out on the field and moving cones around and running practices. It's all of the relational elements of it is a big trend. And so, you look at the size of athletic departments and the amount of politics within them at all levels, and you can start to see where it really wears thin and coaches are stopped from really kind of creating what they want to create. So that's a big one. And then I'd also say that there becomes a little bit of a personal reckoning for a lot of these coaches. When you read some of the articles and really pay attention to what they're saying, they really say very similar things in that they're on this constant treadmill of searching for more purpose in their life, and they eventually run out of trying to find ways to generate purpose within sports. And so there's a personal mission for a lot of them as well. Like I'm thinking of, two of the prominent college examples recently have been Chris Peterson at the University of Washington in football, and Wojo in basketball, and both have really talked about purpose as things that have kind of maybe pushed them away a little bit, or they're searching for. And I think that's a personal journey that others can't necessarily help them with, but it's something that coaches, as we go into really looking at people trying to self-actualize and optimize themselves and their vision and their purpose, and having families as well as a profession, I think those things are coming to the fore. So a little bit of hierarchy and politics is a trend, and then a little bit of people really looking for their own life's purpose.
I want to potentially throw out two more other reasons, and I'd love for you to push back on it or expand upon these. And when I look at the exodus, I would say one is that some coaches are struggling to evolve. I think the sports landscape is changing. I think, society is changing, the athletes changing. And in any good profession, a professional would grow, they'd evolve, and they would evolve their practices, the way that they coach, the way that they lead, the way that they teach. And I think some are stuck in the way that they coached 30, 40 years ago. And they're like, all right, well, I don't want to change. So that's one other one. And you can challenge me on that. And the other one I think is the cost is becoming too great. Like the amount of time, there's no down season. There's just the amount of time and just the other social cost, the pressures are growing. And that's just like, what, it used to be worth it, but now it's not, so I don't know. What do you think of those two other reasons as well?
No, I don't disagree with those. I think those are kind of elements of potentially what that kind of overarching trend that I was talking about as well, in terms of the some of the administrative pressure or the coaching landscape. Like you're essentially forced into coaching a particular way now on pressure. And you're shamed if you don't coach that way. And you're one comment away from it all being over anyway. And so those are really, two things that I would point out that probably merge what you're talking about there, JP, as well, in that it's changed in such a way that, with player power at the professional levels, player power at the college levels, there's an awful lot of fear now just in the real basics of elite sport. Trying to organize a training session can be like pulling teeth. And so that certainly adds to the cost. And I think, bundled together, all those things, you're right. People are just opting and saying, this isn't worth it now. It is lucrative, and I could potentially set my family up financially for a long time. However, the balance of trying to achieve that versus, sending potentially one text message that might, shatter my reputation completely, not just within sports, my whole life's reputation and what I've stood for can go away. I'm not interested in being a part of that industry. And so, I would agree with you on those two additions.
Well, Cody, I want to follow up on a couple of those things too. When, the player empowerment movement, and whether that's the NIL stuff in the college game, or it's the lucrative contracts in the professional game, it seems that more and more, coaches maybe, I don't know if walking on eggshells is the right way, but as you said, there's always this fear of, if I push too hard, will they leave? Will they transfer? Will they go somewhere else? How do you counsel coaches that are trying to find that fine line between, there is a certain amount of feedback and criticism that comes with coaching, and yet, trying to balance that with athlete retention in a program?
Yeah, JP kind of talked about something there that forms the core of my idea around this. And that is that I think what we've done historically is a really poor job of explaining coaching to those being coached. And so, there are numerous ways that we can do that help athletes understand why certain things are being done. Now, that fundamentally means that coaches need to understand why things are being done. And so it raises the consciousness of the coaches as well as the consciousness of the athletes. And so, that's not to say that every single thing needs to be explained down to the nth degree, but I think it becomes incumbent on us as coaches to explain, at least philosophically, why certain things are being done, or how hard certain decisions are, or, there are exercises that you can do around, team selection and things like that to have athletes appreciate that the sixth player, like your first bench player, is often the most difficult player to select. It's not the first, right? And so people complain about playing time and being on the bench and all these kind of things. Like, okay, well, can we do an exercise that actually shows them how difficult it is for the coaches to go through that? And so my point here is that where I try to go with coaches in finding that line is starting with actually explaining what's going on to the people that it's happening to, and how you think about it, and why they're having to do it, and how it's going to transfer to the game, I think is a good start. Because what we've tended to do is just to have coaching that's done to athletes, and they need to trust 100% that we're doing the right thing and doing it with their best interests at heart. Whereas I think we can come a little bit towards them from that 100% and say, we'll show you, what the idea is behind it. You might not fully understand, but at least I've articulated it to you. Similarly to, my son is never going to understand what parenting is about until he becomes a parent himself, and then it's all going to fall into place. There's a little bit of that dynamic that's always going to exist between coaches and athletes until those athletes become coaches. There's always going to be that dynamic, but I think we can still go some way to explaining coaching to those that are being coached.
Well, I think similar to that, it opens up a dialogue, right? So in some sense, there's the players that don't always understand the coaching perspective. And I think more and more there's coaches that don't understand the current player perspective either, to see that as a resource and an opportunity for cooperation rather than the battle lines between my way, or the highway or whatever it might be as far as that goes. I want to pivot to and ask you, come back to this idea of pressures from administration, or you see, friction between administration and coaches. And, a lot of our listeners are at the high school level, and, maybe not working at the same, financial pressures and of the professional level, for example. But obviously, there's lots of opportunity there for things to go awry as well. And so I wonder, when you think about trying to create an infrastructure that is supportive of coaches in the modern environment, what would you say to high school athletic directors or athletic departments? Are there principles that they could draw from to create a more supportive environment from an athletic department in general that would help to be more supportive of coaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the high school, you can look at it two ways. High school is unique, or high school isn't unique, and it's organizational dynamics, regardless of whether it's high school football or Google. I look at it that if we strip away the actual subject matter, the fact that it's a high school athletic department, I look at it from what are the commonalities here and where can we learn from other organizations? Because ultimately that's what it is. It's an organization that's looking to produce an end product, which is on the field. And so what are the inputs that go into that? Ultimately, when we talk about friction, the way that an organization is supposed to work is that it's organized. The clue is actually in the name, believe it or not. And Bill Walsh points that out in a couple of his books. He's got some great quotes around it. But the key to an organization is that it is organized. And when you talk about friction and friction points, whatever they may be, ultimately we're supposed to be rowing in the same direction. And the friction is supposed to be the water, right? Like when we're rowing, the friction is the enemy is the water on the outside, not the people in the boat. And so what we've done is somehow created friction within the boat and friction in the water as well. And so a starting point is certainly we have to be on the same page. We have to have the same vision for what we're trying to create. And it doesn't mean we're necessarily there right now. However, I would imagine athletic department administrators and athletic department coaches can get together and try to come up with a collective vision for where the program is supposed to go and what are the elements of how do we build towards that. And that goes back to really, really basic things. But what it does, to what you talked about earlier, Nate, is it creates a dialogue, because coaches also aren't necessarily aware of the challenges that administrators are dealing with and the pressures that they're going through to try to create what they're trying to create, which isn't completely consumed by coaching like coaches are. They have other pressures as well that they're dealing with. And so if we can start to communicate those, coordinate those, and at least be rowing in the same direction, with people in the boat that are rowing in the same direction, I think that's a good start. And that's advice that's not limited to high school necessarily. That's just good fundamentals of organizational dynamics.
Yeah, I think one of the other things too, though, is there's this new level or layer of accountability that's coming from administrations, and what that looks like and what they're holding coaches accountable to is different. And sometimes it's wins and losses. Sometimes it's just they want empty email boxes of, from complaints or HR. And other times it's, there's been some things that have surfaced, obviously, in a lot of sports hockey in Canada, gymnastics in America, with levels of abuse that should not be tolerated and accepted. And I would also argue, and I think I've said this for a while, some of the ways that we coach, some of the ways that I've coached in the past should have been dealt with more accountability. Like I should have been pulled into my athletic director's office for the level of my lack of emotional control on the sideline. Right. So I actually think there needs to be some level of accountability within an athletic department as well. It seems like there is this pendulum swing in some areas where it's, all of a sudden now the administrations and high schools and colleges and clubs now are maybe a little bit too watchful. I mean, I don't know if you have any comments on that, but it's kind of this confusing area now, I think, and coaches are walking on eggshells.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm the same. I mean, I came through as a player with things that you would never see today. And early in my coaching career would have mirrored those either beliefs or behaviors. And undoubtedly that things have needed to be dealt with. And again, there's a reckoning coming for a lot of those. And that's fine. And they should be held accountable to those. But also what we need to be careful of is conflating that with all coaching. And, the vast majority of coaches that I meet with, speak to, only have the best interests of their athletes. They are giving people. They are interested and love teaching the sport and want the best for their athletes. The vast majority. But if you were to listen to the news, you would say that every coach that's ever coached at any level was a horrible person and would only scream at their athletes, for 2 hours every training session. Simply not the case. But at the same time, the safe sport movement feels like it was just handed down without consultation to coaches and an understanding of what coaching needs to be or is about. And so I think that's kind of what we're talking about, that gap, was just this kind of set of rules that don't seem to make any sense to the progress of the coaching discipline. It is just a set of, railroad rules that don't allow for any coaching to happen. And so, that's a space that, unfortunately, most of us have found ourselves in now. And it will continue to evolve and conversations need to continue to happen. But, I think what you're describing there is just this really heavy sense that a lot of coaches have and fear-based. So they would rather do nothing than, obliterate their careers because of potentially something that someone else might have done even. It doesn't even need to be them anymore.
Yeah, and you use that word fear, and I love that because I think so often we used fear sometimes. I mean, I use fear to motivate and to get players to do stuff. Now I see rather than coaches using fear as much, I think they're coaching out of fear more often. Like they're afraid of, different repercussions, like you said, whether it's sending a wrong text message down to saying the wrong thing to a player, and that player takes that and, it becomes, that player, becomes their reason for them showing up to a mental health clinic. Like it's just these type of things that I've walked with coaches through where they've gotten kind of blamed for certain things, that so we're coaching from that place of fear, which is probably not healthy for the coach's performance, is it?
No, it's not. And you're right. Often it's not necessarily, their fault or can be pinned directly on them. And so this becomes a really interesting conversation now, though, because, another thing that I asked on social media was, do you think someone that is living in a fear-based culture can create a healthy and high-performing culture underneath them. So if we were looking at the hierarchical, and just take this for the vision more so than me explaining it this way, it's through lack of a better way of putting it. But, in terms of the hierarchy, the administration sits above the coach. The coach is essentially a middle manager. So let's say that it's a poisonous, fractured, friction-filled athletic department, of which a coach is fearful for their job, for the financial security of their family. They are fearful of communicating with players, and basically that they live in a culture of fear day in and day out. Can that person, who has so much bearing on the culture of their team, can they create a healthy and high-performing team if they live in a culture of fear? I would argue they can in the very, very short term. But eventually the weight of essentially they'll be crushed by the fear eventually. They can kind of hold the boulder up for so long on their own. But I don't think over the long term they're really going to be able to create a healthy and high-performing environment. So the question becomes, sure, coaches have helped create maybe a culture of fear, but if they are living through it too, how are we expecting them to go and create these healthy and high-performing environments for their athletes if they're just living in a state of fear themselves? I think that's a conversation that we really need to have, because that's probably the state that most are in now, and it's why most are walking away and saying, to use your words earlier, JP, that it's just not worth it.
So, Cody, when you describe it that way, what's the antidote for coaches? Is the issue of fear my lack of resiliency or coping mechanisms, or my own personal approach, or is it the administration has to do a better job of creating a psychologically safe place for me to perform, or is it both? Or in many cases we may not have influence over the administration. So what is the counsel for coaches that find themselves relating to what you just described there?
Yeah, I mean, it's both and all. We're talking about change at a multi-level way of doing things here, because it can't just be the coaches that evolve and change, right? They live in an environment too. It can't just be the athletes that evolve and change. It can't just be the administration. We've got to look at the systems that we have in place. Coach education has a lot to answer for. If it's not preparing coaches for the job of today, then what is it doing? So there's a systemic piece there. So do we need to have more education on resilience and tenacity and politics and organizational dynamics and non-technical things, that rather than shoving another module on drills into our coach education, how about we prepare them for the actual job that they're going to do? And so again, there are a lot of factors that fit into this, but yeah, just to kind of step through them from an administration perspective is, an understanding of what a coach is actually going through would be a good start. And starting with taking them at face value, because I think a lot of coaches try to raise these things or tell me that they have raised these things and they fall on deaf ears. And one of the most interesting things that happened off the back of writing the tough stuff was how many people messaged me and said, I've sent your book to my athletic director because I've been telling them this for years and they didn't listen to me. And they thought I was just complaining because I'm a whiny coach and because all coaches are whiny and we all push too much to, get new bibs and new this and new that. And what I want, they say to me that the book helped them validate with administrators that this is the lived experience of coaches all around the world, and it's not just them being whiny. And so to me, that says that, you know, athletic departments can listen to their coaches and actually listen rather than judge and say, okay, if that's what you're going through, how do we help set you up for success? And that filters down the chain, hopefully, where whatever your version of safety is, and it doesn't need to be, you know, lifelong contracts, no one's asking for that, but some more reasonable measures and accountability measures for coaches helps them create a healthy and high-performing environment for their athletes, because it does go down the chain. Like, it starts at the top and works its way down, and a coach is a part of that system, but not the only part.
So we're going to take a break in our conversation with Cody. We'll be back next episode to talk about viewing the coach as a performer and when and how to leave coaching. In the meantime, be sure to check out my latest book, The Culture System, if you haven't already. Wherever you coach, whatever level, and wherever you are on the journey, I truly believe it will help you to tackle some of the challenges we mentioned today.